When she opened the kitchen door that morning, she never imagined that the seemingly innocent scene would quietly destroy the foundations of her 15-year marriage. The aunt she had welcomed out of kindness was making coffee as if she owned the house, but there was something in her gestures that made her heart race with a terrible suspicion. The coffee mug slipped from Sarah's fingers the moment she saw her. Standing there in her kitchen, moving through the space like she owned it, was her sister-in-law Rebecca, preparing breakfast with an intimacy that made Sarah's heart pound with sudden, inexplicable dread. The way Rebecca handled the spatula, the way she knew exactly where the good plates were kept, the way she hummed softly while scrambling eggs, it was all wrong, terribly, devastatingly wrong. "Morning, honey," Rebecca called out without turning around, her voice carrying a warmth that felt too comfortable, too familiar. "I made your favorite, blueberry pancakes with that maple syrup David loves so much." David. The way she said his name made something cold twist in Sarah's stomach. Not your husband or my brother-in-law, just David. Simple, intimate, like they shared secrets Sarah didn't know about. Sarah forced herself to breathe, to think rationally. Rebecca had only been staying with them for 3 weeks since her messy divorce from that awful man she'd married 20 years ago. 3 weeks of Sarah trying to be the supportive sister-in-law, opening her home, her heart, her life to someone who needed shelter from her own storm. 3 weeks of telling herself she was doing the right thing, the Christian thing, the family thing. But something had shifted this morning, something in the way Rebecca moved through Sarah's kitchen like she belonged there more than Sarah herself did. "Where's David?" Sarah asked, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "Oh, he left early for work, said something about a big presentation today." Rebecca finally turned around, and Sarah saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked almost like guilt, but disappeared so quickly, Sarah wondered if she'd imagined it. "He asked me to tell you he'd be home late tonight, maybe around 10. He hadn't told Sarah about any presentation. In 15 years of marriage, David always shared his work stress with her. Always. They talked about everything. His difficult clients, her part-time job at the community center, their daughter Emma's college plans, their dreams of renovating the back porch. They were partners, best friends, soulmates even. Weren't they? Did he say anything else? Sarah found herself asking, hating how desperate she sounded. Rebecca smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. Just that you shouldn't wait up. You know how these corporate things can drag on. But David worked for a small accounting firm. There were no corporate things that dragged on until 10 at night. Sarah knew this because she'd been married to him since she was 25, because she'd supported him through his career changes, because she knew his schedule better than her own. Unless things had changed, unless there were parts of David's life she didn't know about anymore. The thought hit her like a physical blow. Sarah grabbed the counter to steady herself, her wedding ring catching the morning light and throwing tiny rainbows across the granite surface. 15 years of marriage, 15 years of trust, partnership, shared dreams. One daughter, one mortgage, one life, built brick by careful brick. "Sarah, are you okay? You look pale." Rebecca's voice carried concern, but something else too. Something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "I'm fine, just tired." Sarah forced herself to stand straight to look normal. "I think I'll skip breakfast. I have some errands to run." She needed to get out of this house, needed to think, needed to figure out why her instincts were screaming at her to run when logic told her she was being paranoid and cruel to a woman who just escaped an abusive marriage. But as Sarah grabbed her keys and purse, she caught Rebecca watching her in the hallway mirror. The expression on her sister-in-law's face wasn't the grateful, vulnerable look of someone who'd been rescued. It was calculating, cold, almost predatory. Sarah pretended not to notice and headed for her car, but her hands were shaking as she started the engine. 3 weeks. Had it really only been 3 weeks since Rebecca had shown up on their doorstep, with 2 suitcases and tear-stained cheeks, begging for somewhere to stay while she figured out her next move? It felt like Rebecca had been part of their lives much longer than that. She'd integrated herself into their routines, so seamlessly, so naturally. She knew where everything was in the kitchen. She knew David's favorite foods, his work schedule, his coffee preferences. She knew which grocery store they used, which gas station, which dry cleaner. How did she know all these things? Sarah drove aimlessly through their suburban neighborhood, past the neat houses with their perfect lawns and their perfect families, or at least families that looked perfect from the outside. How many of these homes held secrets? How many of these marriages were built on foundations that could crumble with just the right pressure applied to just the right weak spot? Her phone buzzed with a text message. David. Working. Late tonight, don't wait up, love you. The same message Rebecca had already delivered, word for word, which meant either David had told Rebecca exactly what to say, or Rebecca had somehow known what David was going to text before he'd even sent it. Both possibilities made Sarah feel sick. She pulled into the parking lot of their local Starbucks, needing caffeine and normalcy and space to think. But as she sat in her car staring at her phone, another thought crept in. A worse thought. What if David hadn't sent that text at all? Sarah's hands were trembling as she scrolled through their message history. David's texts were usually longer, more personal. He'd add little details about his day, ask about her plans, mention something funny he'd heard on the radio. This message was sterile, generic, not like him at all. Unless he was trying to create distance, unless he was pulling away from her, and she'd been too trusting to notice, or unless someone else had sent it. The thought made her stomach drop. Rebecca had been staying in their guest room, which was right next to David's home office. She would have access to his laptop, his personal items, maybe even his phone if he'd left it charging overnight like he sometimes did. Sarah forced herself to breathe deeply. This was crazy thinking, paranoid thinking. Rebecca was family. She was hurting, vulnerable, trying to rebuild her life after her husband had cheated on her with his secretary in the most cliché possible way. Sarah was supposed to be helping her, supporting her, showing Christian charity. But what if Rebecca's story wasn't entirely true? What if her marriage had ended for different reasons? What if she wasn't the victim she claimed to be? Sarah realized she didn't actually know very much about Rebecca's marriage. They'd never been particularly close. Rebecca lived 3 states away and had always been somewhat aloof at family gatherings. Sarah knew Rebecca had married young, that she'd never had children, that she'd worked various jobs over the years. But the details of her life, her personality, her character, those were mysteries Sarah had never bothered to solve. Maybe she should have. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Emma texting from her dorm room 2 hours away. Dad said Aunt Rebecca is going through a tough time. Should I come home this weekend to help out? Emma, their sweet, empathetic 19-year-old daughter who wanted to fix everyone and everything. The thought of Emma getting pulled into whatever this situation was becoming made Sarah's protective instincts flare. She texted back quickly, "That's sweet of you, but focus on your studies. We've got everything handled here." But they didn't have everything handled. Sarah was starting to realize they might not have anything handled at all. She sat in her car for another 20 minutes, watching people go in and out of the coffee shop. Normal people with normal problems. People who probably weren't wondering if their sister-in-law was trying to steal their husband. People who trusted their instincts without second-guessing every feeling. When had she stopped trusting herself? It had happened gradually, she realized. Over the past few years, David had started questioning her perceptions more often. When she'd expressed concern about Emma's new boyfriend, David had said she was being overprotective. When she'd worried about their finances, he'd called her anxious. When she'd suggested they needed to spend more time together as a couple, he'd accused her of being needy. Little by little, her confidence in her own judgment had been eroded. She'd learned to dismiss her instincts, to assume she was wrong, to defer to David's more rational perspective. But what if her instincts had been right all along? What if David's dismissal of her concerns had been part of something larger, something more calculated? The thought was so painful she almost couldn't bear it. But she had to face the possibility that the man she'd loved and trusted for 15 years might not be the person she thought he was. Sarah finally went into the coffee shop and ordered her usual, a large vanilla latte with an extra shot. The familiar ritual calmed her slightly, gave her something normal to focus on, but as she waited for her order, she found herself studying the other customers. A young couple sharing a muffin, both absorbed in their phones, an older man reading a newspaper, occasionally glancing at a woman across the room who seemed oblivious to his attention, a group of mothers discussing their children's school activities, normal interactions between normal people. But how much of what she was seeing was real, and how much was performance? How many of these people were hiding secrets from the ones they claimed to love? Her latte was ready. Sarah thanked the barista and headed back to her car, but she didn't want to go home yet. Didn't want to face Rebecca's too comfortable presence in her kitchen, didn't want to pretend everything was fine when something was clearly very wrong. Instead, she drove to the community center where she worked part-time. Maybe focusing on something productive would help clear her head. The center ran programs for seniors and low-income families, and Sarah had always found the work meaningful. Helping other people had always helped her feel better about her own problems. But today, even the familiar environment felt strange. Her co-workers seemed to be looking at her differently, speaking to her with a kind of careful kindness that suggested they knew something she didn't. "Sarah, honey," said Marge, the center's director, "are you doing okay? You seem a little off today." "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically, then wondered if she was. "Just some family stuff. Nothing serious." But Marge's expression suggested she knew it was serious. "Well, if you need to talk, you know I'm here. And if you need some time off to handle things at home..." Time off? Why would she need time off? Unless Marge knew something about David, about Rebecca, about whatever was happening in Sarah's life that she herself was only beginning to understand. "Has David been by here recently?" Sarah found herself asking. "To pick me up or drop something? Off?" Marge looked uncomfortable. Not David, no, but that sister-in-law of yours stopped by yesterday. Rebecca? She seemed to know a lot about your work here. Said she might be interested in volunteering." Rebecca had been here, at Sarah's workplace, without mentioning it, learning about Sarah's life, her routines, her relationships outside the home. "Did she say anything else?" Sarah's voice came, out sharper than she'd intended. "Just that she was grateful for how welcoming you'd been, how you'd opened your home to her during her difficult time." Marge paused. She seemed like a lovely woman, very friendly, very interested in your family. Too interested, Sarah thought. Way too interested. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of her work, but her mind was racing. Rebecca had been mapping her life, learning her patterns, inserting herself into spaces where she didn't belong. The workplace visit wasn't casual curiosity, it was reconnaissance. But reconnaissance for what? By the time Sarah's shift ended, she'd made a decision. She was going to pay attention, really pay attention, to Rebecca's behavior, to David's responses, to the small details that had been bothering her. She was going to trust her instincts. Instead of dismissing them, she was going to find out what was really happening in her own home. The drive back felt different this time. Instead of the familiar comfort of returning to her sanctuary, Sarah felt like she was approaching enemy territory. Her own house, the place where she'd been happy for 15 years, now felt dangerous. But she was ready for whatever she might find, or at least she thought she was. Sarah sat in her car outside her own house for 10 full minutes, studying it like she'd never seen it before. The white colonial with its blue shutters and carefully maintained garden looked exactly the same as always, but something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer just her home. It was a stage where some kind of performance was taking place, and she was the only one who didn't know her lines. The front door opened before she'd even gotten out of the car. Rebecca appeared, waving cheerfully, wearing one of Sarah's aprons. Sarah's favorite apron, actually, the one Emma had given her for Mother's Day 3 years ago, with "World's Best Mom" embroidered in purple thread. Perfect timing. Rebecca called out, "I just pulled your famous lasagna out of the oven." My famous lasagna, the recipe Sarah had spent years perfecting, the one she only made for special occasions because it took 4 hours from start to finish. The recipe she'd never shared with anyone, not even Emma, because it was her signature dish. Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she walked up the front steps. "How did you know how to make it?" Rebecca's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, I found your recipe box while I was looking for something to cook. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to do something nice for you and David." The recipe box was kept in the back of the pantry, behind the flour and sugar, in a spot where someone would only find it if they were specifically searching through Sarah's kitchen, with purpose and time. It wasn't somewhere you'd stumble across while looking for ingredients for a simple meal. "That was thoughtful," Sarah managed, following Rebecca into the house that smelled like her own cooking but felt completely foreign. The dining room table was set for two, fine china, cloth napkins, candles. The kind of romantic setup Sarah used to create for anniversary dinners back when she and David still celebrated such things with intention and joy. "Where's David?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to dread the answer. "Still at work. Remember? I thought it would be nice for us to have dinner together, girl time. We never really get to talk, just the two of us." Rebecca's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief or might have been malice. "I feel like I barely know you, even though David's told me so much about you over the years." Over the years, not just since Rebecca had arrived 3 weeks ago. Over the years suggested a longer, deeper connection between David and his sister-in-law than Sarah had ever realized existed. "What kinds of things has he told you?" Sarah tried to keep her voice casual as she sat down at her own dining room table, feeling like a guest in her own home. "Oh, you know, how you met, your wedding day, Emma's childhood, your dreams of traveling to Italy someday." Rebecca served the lasagna with Sarah's best serving spoon, the silver one that had been her grandmother's. "He's always spoken about you with such affection." Affection, not love, not adoration or devotion, or any of the words a husband might. I used to describe the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. Affection was what you felt for a favorite pet or a pleasant acquaintance. Sarah took a bite of her own lasagna, made by another woman's hands in her own kitchen. It tasted exactly right, which somehow made everything feel more wrong. "How long have you and David been in touch? I mean, regularly?" "Oh, we've always kept in contact. Christmas cards, birthday wishes, that sort of thing." Rebecca's tone was light, but she was focusing very intently on her plate. "Family should stay connected, don't you think?" But Sarah couldn't remember David ever mentioning phone calls with Rebecca. Couldn't remember him writing Christmas cards to her, or even mentioning her birthday. For 15 years, Rebecca had been a vague presence on the periphery of their lives. Someone who showed up to major family events, exchanged pleasantries, and then disappeared back to her own life 3 states away. When had that changed? And why hadn't David mentioned it? "Rebecca," Sarah said carefully, "when exactly did your marriage start having problems?" This time, Rebecca's pause was longer, more deliberate. "It's hard to say exactly. These things happen gradually, you know. One day you wake up and realize you're living with a stranger." The words hit Sarah like a slap, because that's exactly how she'd been feeling lately. Like she was living with a stranger. Like the man she'd married had slowly, subtly transformed into someone she didn't recognize, and she'd been too trusting or too comfortable to notice until it was too late. "What was the final straw?" Sarah pressed. "What made you finally decide to leave?" Rebecca set down her fork and looked directly at Sarah for the first time since she'd sat down. "I found out he was having an affair with someone I trusted, someone who was supposed to care about me." The pain in Rebecca's voice sounded genuine, and for a moment Sarah felt a wave of sympathy. But then Rebecca continued. "The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing that everyone else probably knew and just felt sorry for me, that I was the only one stupid enough not to see what was happening right under my nose." Sarah's blood ran cold, because Rebecca was looking at her with an expression that seemed to say, "You know exactly what I mean, don't you?" "That must have been devastating," Sarah whispered. "It was, but also liberating, in a way. Once you accept that your life isn't what you thought it was, You can start making choices based on reality instead of fantasy. Rebecca picked up her fork again, her demeanor shifting back to casual friendliness. This lasagna really is delicious. David's going to be so sorry he missed it. But Sarah barely heard her. Her mind was spinning with implications, with connections she didn't want to make but couldn't avoid. Rebecca's marriage had ended because of an affair with someone she trusted. Rebecca had been in contact with David for years without Sarah knowing. Rebecca had shown up at their door just when Sarah had been feeling most disconnected from her husband, most uncertain about the state of her marriage. Was Rebecca trying to tell her something? Or was Sarah's paranoia finally pushing her over, the edge into genuine delusion? "I should probably save David a plate," Sarah said, starting to stand up. "Oh, don't worry. About that, I already made one up for him. It's in the fridge with a little note." Rebecca's smile was bright and helpful. "I know how much he appreciates thoughtful gestures." Sarah sat back down heavily. Rebecca was already taking care of David, already anticipating his needs, already inserting herself into the intimate routines of Sarah's marriage, and doing it all under the guise of being helpful, being considerate, being the perfect houseguest. "Rebecca," Sarah said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Have you and David before you were married to your ex-husband, did you and David ever have any kind of relationship?" The question hung in the air between them like a live wire. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, or admiration that Sarah had been brave enough to ask. "What makes you ask that?" "Just answer the question, please." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, twirling pasta around her fork with careful precision. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and almost wistful. "David and I dated briefly in college. It was a long time ago, Sarah. Before he ever met you." Sarah's world tilted. "How briefly?" "About 2 years." Rebecca's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something else underneath it, something that sounded almost like nostalgia. "We were quite serious, actually, talked about marriage, children, the whole future together. But then life got in the way, as it usually does. 2 years, they dated for 2 years, talked about marriage, and David had never mentioned it. Not once in 15 years of their own marriage had he ever said, 'Rebecca used to be my girlfriend,' or 'we have a history,' or 'this might be awkward.' Why didn't it work out?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Distance, mainly. He got a job offer here, and I wasn't ready to leave school. We thought we could make long-distance work, but..." Rebecca shrugged. "Young love is intense but fragile. By the time I graduated, he'd already met you." Already met you? Like Sarah had been the consolation prize, the runner-up, the woman who'd happened to be available when Rebecca wasn't. "Does he know you're telling me this?" Sarah asked. "We haven't discussed it." Rebecca's smile was gentle, almost pitying. "I figured it wasn't really relevant anymore. Ancient history and all that." But it wasn't ancient history. Not if Rebecca was here, in Sarah's house, making Sarah's recipes, taking care of Sarah's husband, with an intimacy that suggested muscle memory rather than newfound helpfulness. Not if David had been secretly staying in touch with his college girlfriend for years without telling his wife. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from David. "Running even later than expected. Probably won't be home until midnight. Sorry, babe." Babe. David never called her babe. He called her honey or sweetheart or Sarah. Never babe. She looked up to find Rebecca watching her read the message. "Another delay?" Rebecca asked sympathetically. "How did you know it was from David?" "Lucky guess. You had that worried wife expression." Rebecca reached across the table and patted Sarah's hand. "You shouldn't worry so much. David's a good man. He's just working hard to provide for his family." The patronizing tone made Sarah want to scream, but instead, she excused herself and went upstairs to their bedroom, needing space to think and breathe and figure out what to do with all these terrible new pieces of information. Their bedroom felt different too, cleaner than usual, but in the wrong way. like someone had been going through their things with careful hands, putting everything back exactly where it belonged, but leaving an invisible fingerprint of intrusion. Sarah opened David's closet and immediately knew someone had been there. His shirts were organized by color in a way that was too perfect, too systematic. David was neat but not obsessive. He hung his shirts up in whatever order he took them off the hangers, creating a comfortable randomness that Sarah had grown used to over the years. This looked like the closet of someone who was trying to impress, or someone who had reorganized it according to their own preferences and aesthetic sense. Sarah's hands were shaking as she checked David's dresser drawers. Same thing. Everything was neat and perfectly arranged in a way that wasn't quite David's style. His sock drawer in particular looked like a retail display. David stuffed his socks into the drawer with comfortable carelessness. He didn't roll them into perfect pairs and arrange them by color. Someone had been going through their most private spaces. Someone had been touching their clothes, their belongings, the intimate details of their daily life. And there was only one person it could be. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed she'd shared with David for 15 years and tried to process what she was learning. Rebecca and David had a romantic history. Rebecca had been reorganizing their personal spaces. Rebecca knew details about their life that seemed too intimate, too insider, for someone who was supposed to be a casual houseguest. And David was working late more often, texting differently, being evasive about his schedule. Sarah pulled out her laptop and did something she'd never done in 15 years of marriage. She started investigating her own husband. His social media profiles, his email accounts that she had access to, his recent credit card statements. What she found made her stomach drop. Charges at restaurants she'd never been to. Receipts from a florist, flowers she'd never received. A hotel charge from 2 months ago, during a weekend when David had supposedly been at a work conference that Sarah now couldn't find any record of online. 2 months ago. Right around the time Rebecca's marriage had started falling apart, according to her story. Sarah's hands were trembling as she scrolled through more transactions, expensive dinners, gifts from jewelry stores, charges at lingerie boutiques, ADZ, whole secret financial life that David had been hiding from her. And then she found the email. It was in David's deleted folder, which he'd apparently forgotten to permanently delete. A message from Rebecca dated 6 months ago. I can't stop thinking about what you said. Maybe it really is time for both of us to be brave enough to choose happiness over stability. I'm scared, but I'm also tired of living a lie. If you meant what you said about giving us another chance, I'm ready to take that risk. Just tell me when and how. 6 months ago. Long before Rebecca's supposed separation. Long before she'd shown up on their doorstep with her suitcases and her tears and her story about an unfaithful husband. Sarah read the email 3 times before the full implications hit her. This hadn't been a spontaneous reunion of old friends. This had been planned, orchestrated. Rebecca's marriage had ended not because her husband was unfaithful, but because she had been with David. And now she was here in Sarah's house, sleeping in the room next to Sarah's daughter's childhood bedroom, cooking in Sarah's kitchen, taking care of Sarah's husband while Sarah went to work, and tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. Sarah heard Rebecca's footsteps on the stairs and quickly closed the laptop. She had to pretend everything was normal while she figured out what to do with this information. Had to keep playing the role of the oblivious wife while her marriage dissolved around her. But as Rebecca's voice drifted up from the hallway, humming softly while she tidied up after dinner, Sarah realized she was past the point of pretending. She knew the truth now. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the house. David had come home just after midnight, exactly as his text had promised, moving through their bedroom with careful quietness, but instead of the considerate husband trying not to wake his sleeping wife, Sarah sensed something different in his movements. Guilt, maybe, or relief that he could maintain his performance for another day. At 3 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, deliberate steps that paused outside their bedroom door for a long moment before continuing. Toward the guest room, Sarah held her breath, every muscle in her body tense until she heard Rebecca's door close with the quietest possible click. Had Rebecca been checking on them, making sure David was safely in bed with his wife, playing his part in this elaborate charade? When morning came, Sarah was exhausted but determined. She had a plan now, born from hours of sleepless thinking and a clarity that only comes when you're forced to confront the worst possible truth about your life. She waited until David left for work, kissing her goodbye with the same casual affection he'd shown for years, except now it felt like a performance. Then she waited until Rebecca went out for her morning jog, a new routine she'd started since moving in, claiming she needed to clear her head and get her strength back. The moment Rebecca's figure disappeared around the corner, Sarah moved into action. She started in the guest room, searching with the systematic thoroughness of someone who finally understood what she was looking for. In the back of the closet, behind Rebecca's carefully hung clothes, Sarah found a shoebox that didn't belong to Rebecca at all. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Pictures of David and Rebecca from college, looking young and happy and completely in love. Pictures of them at graduation, at parties, on romantic vacations, to places David had never taken Sarah. And then, more disturbing, recent photographs. David at his office, taken from across the street with a long-range lens. Sarah herself photographed without her knowledge as she worked in their garden, as she went shopping, as she picked up Emma from school during her last visit home. Someone had been watching them, studying them, learning their routines and vulnerabilities. At the bottom of the box, Sarah found something that made her hands shake, a copy of their marriage certificate, not the original, that was safely locked in their home safe, but a photocopy with handwritten notes in the margins. Notes about David's previous relationships, about Sarah's family background, about their financial situation. Research notes like someone preparing for a job interview or planning a campaign. Underneath that were printed emails, dozens of them, spanning years, conversations between David and Rebecca that revealed a relationship that had never really ended, despite marriages to other people, despite the distance, despite everything. "I think about you every day," David had written 2 years ago. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd been brave enough to fight for each other back then. I dream about the life we could have had," Rebecca had replied. "The children we might have raised together, the house we might have shared. Do you ever regret choosing stability over love?" "Every single day," David had written back. "But it's too late now. We both made our choices." But apparently it hadn't been too late. Because here, in emails from just 6 months ago, Sarah found the evidence of how they decided to undo those choices. "I can't live like this anymore," Rebecca had written. "Pretending to be happy in a marriage that was always second best. I'm going to leave him, David. I'm going to take control of my life and stop settling for less than what I really want." "Are you sure?" David had replied. "Sarah doesn't deserve this. She's a good person. She's been a good wife. But you don't love her the way you love me," Rebecca had written back. "And she deserves to be with someone who loves her completely, not someone who's always wondering what if." Sarah had to stop reading for a moment, the words hitting her, like physical blows. David didn't love her the way he loved Rebecca. David was staying with her out of obligation, out of habit, out of some misguided sense of duty to a woman he'd settled for when he couldn't have what he really wanted. 15 years of marriage, 1 beautiful daughter, a home, a life, a future. They'd planned together, all of it built on a foundation of David's compromise and regret. But the emails continued, and they got worse. "I have a plan," Rebecca had written 3 months ago. "If you're serious about this, if you really want to try again, I know how we can do it. I can come to you. I can make Sarah understand that our marriage is over, that you deserve to be happy." "How?" David had asked. "Let me worry about the details. Just trust me. By the time I'm done, she'll practically beg you to leave her. She'll think it was her idea." Sarah's vision blurred with tears of rage and betrayal. Rebecca hadn't just been planning to steal her husband. She'd been planning to manipulate Sarah into giving him up willingly to destroy her self-esteem and confidence so thoroughly that she'd believed the dissolution of her marriage was somehow her own fault. And it had been working. Over the past 3 weeks, Sarah had been questioning herself constantly, wondering if she was being paranoid, if she was seeing problems that didn't exist. Rebecca had been subtly undermining her confidence, making her feel like a jealous, suspicious wife who was imagining things. Sarah heard the front door open and quickly shoved everything back into the shoebox, her heart pounding. Rebecca's voice drifted up the stairs. "Sarah, I brought you coffee from that place you like." Perfect. Even in her manipulation, Rebecca was being thoughtful, caring, impossible to hate completely. It was diabolical in its effectiveness. "Just a minute," Sarah called back, shoving the shoebox back into its hiding place and trying to compose herself. She had to be smart about this, had to think strategically instead of emotionally, because now she understood the scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated campaign to dismantle her life and transfer it to someone else. Rebecca hadn't just seduced David. She'd researched Sarah, studied her weaknesses, planned her destruction with the thoroughness of a military operation. But Sarah had advantages Rebecca didn't know about. She knew the truth now. She had evidence. And she had something Rebecca would never have, the righteous fury of a woman protecting her family. When Sarah came downstairs, Rebecca was arranging flowers in a vase, flowers that looked exactly like the ones from David's secret credit card charges. The symbolism was probably intentional. Rebecca was literally bringing into Sarah's home the evidence of her husband's betrayal and expecting Sarah to thank her for it. "These are beautiful," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "Where did you get them?" "Oh, I saw them at the grocery store and couldn't resist. David mentioned once that you love white roses." Rebecca's smile was warm and genuine looking. "I thought they might brighten up the kitchen." David had mentioned Sarah's favorite flowers to his former girlfriend turned co-conspirator. They'd discussed Sarah's preferences, probably laughing about how easy she was to please, how grateful she'd be for such simple gestures. "That was very thoughtful," Sarah managed. "Rebecca, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you were married, did you ever suspect your husband was cheating before you found definitive proof?" Rebecca's hands stilled on the flowers. "What makes you ask that?" "I'm just curious about how these things usually work. Whether wives really are the last to know, or whether we know on some level but refuse to admit it to ourselves." "I think," Rebecca said carefully, "that women are often much more intuitive than we give ourselves credit for. We sense when something goes wrong long before we can prove it. The question is whether we're brave enough to trust our instincts." "And were you? Brave enough, I mean." Rebecca turned to face Sarah fully, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression was completely honest. Not kind, not manipulative, not performed, just honest. "Not at first. I spent months making excuses for him, explaining away the signs, convincing myself I was being paranoid, but eventually the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And then, you have to decide what you're going to do about it." They stared at each other for a long moment, and Sarah realized they weren't talking about Rebecca's ex-husband anymore. They were talking about David, about the choice Sarah was going to have to make now that she knew the truth. "What did you do about it?" Sarah asked quietly. "I took control of my life. I stopped being a victim and started being an agent of my own destiny." Rebecca's voice was steady, almost proud. "I decided that if someone was going to choose to be happy, it was going to be me." Sarah nodded slowly. "That's very philosophical." "Sometimes philosophy is all we have when the people we love disappoint us." The front door opened and David's voice called out, "Hey, I forgot some files, just grabbing them quick." He stopped dead when he saw Sarah and Rebecca standing in the kitchen together, surrounded by white roses and the weight of everything that had been said and left unsaid. "Hi, honey," Sarah said, and her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "Rebecca was just telling me about her philosophy on taking control of your life." David's eyes flicked between them, and Sarah saw him calculating, trying to figure out how much she knew, how much danger he was in. "That's Great, he said finally. I'll just grab those files and... Actually, Sarah interrupted, I think the three of us should sit down and have a conversation about philosophy and honesty and taking control of our lives. David went very still. Sarah, I don't think... I found the emails, David. Sarah's voice was calm, almost conversational. All of them, going back years. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Rebecca looked at David with something that might have been disappointment or might have been admiration for Sarah's detective work. David looked like a man watching his life implode in real time. Sarah, he said finally, I can explain. I'm sure you can. I'm sure you have a whole speech prepared about how this just happened, how you never meant for it to go this far, how you still care about me but you can't help how you feel. Sarah sat down at her own kitchen table, surrounded by another woman's. Flowers and her husband's lies, but I don't think I want to hear it. So what do you want? Rebecca asked. Her voice wasn't defensive or apologetic. She sounded genuinely curious, like she was interested in Sarah's strategy. I want to understand something, Sarah said. How long were you planning to keep this up? The concerned sister-in-law act, the helpful house guest routine? Were you going to wait for me to have a breakdown and voluntarily commit myself to a mental hospital? Or were you planning something more direct? Rebecca and David exchanged a look that told Sarah everything she needed to know. They'd discussed this. They'd planned contingencies. We never wanted to hurt you, David said quietly, but you were willing to hurt me if that's what it took to get what you wanted. Sarah's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. You were willing to gaslight me, manipulate me, destroy my confidence and my sense of reality, as long as it served your purposes. Sarah, Rebecca started. No. Sarah, cut her off. You don't get to talk anymore. You've been talking for 3 weeks and every word was a lie. Now it's my turn. She stood up and looked at both of them, her husband of 15 years and the woman who'd been systematically dismantling her life. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah said. Rebecca, you're going to pack your things and leave. Today. Now. And you're never going to contact any member of my family again. And David? Rebecca asked. Sarah looked at her husband, this man she'd loved and trusted and built a life with. This man who'd been planning to discard her like an outdated piece of furniture. David and I are going to have a very long conversation about whether our marriage is worth saving, and David is going to decide whether he wants to fight for what we built together, or whether he'd rather chase a fantasy from his college years. It's not a fantasy, David said quietly. Then prove it, Sarah replied. Leave with her right now. Choose her over your daughter, over our life, over everything we've built together. Show me that your college girlfriend is worth throwing away 15 years of marriage. David looked stricken. Sarah, it's not that. Simple. It absolutely is that simple. Either you love me enough to work on our marriage or you don't. Either our life together means something to you or it doesn't. Either you're willing to fight for us or you're not. Sarah walked to the front door and opened it. Rebecca, you have 1 hour to pack. David, you have the rest of your life to decide who you want to be. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Sarah felt like herself again. Not the paranoid, insecure woman she'd been manipulated into becoming, but the strong, decisive person she'd always been before she'd let other people's lies convince her to doubt herself. She didn't know how this would end. Didn't know if David would choose their marriage or his fantasy of recapturing his youth, but she knew she was done being a victim in her own life. Sarah Wilson was taking control of her destiny, and whatever happened next, it would be her choice.